some mistakes leave scars you can't see. This is the story of the one decision that changed me forever. I've asked myself the same question 1,000 times. How did I get here? How did I let everything unravel? Was it weakness? Was it selfishness? Or was it something darker, something I was too afraid to admit about myself? I sit here now, staring at my own reflection, searching for the girl I used to be. The one who had control. The one who had boundaries. The one who knew better. But she's gone. All that's left is me, the girl who made a choice I can't take back. It's strange, isn't it? How one moment, one reckless impulse, can rewrite everything you thought you knew about yourself. I never imagined I'd become this person. I never thought I'd do something that would make me afraid to look people in the eye. But I did. And now, all I have left is the silence. The shame. The weight pressing down on my chest every time I close my eyes. You think you know yourself until you don't. Until you're standing on the edge, staring at something you swore you'd never touch, and you realize, you want it. And in that moment, you forget about the consequences. The guilt. The fallout. The wreckage you'll leave behind. I didn't think about any of that. I only thought about him. And now, I can't undo it. Before we begin, I need to warn you. This story contains mature themes. It deals with the challenges of guilt, temptation, and the consequences of desire. If these topics are difficult for you, I understand if you choose to stop here. But if you stay, I promise you something real. No sugarcoating. No justifications. Just the truth, raw, unfiltered, and haunting. Are you ready? I don't know when it started. I've tried to trace it back to a single moment, a single thought, but I can't. It was always there, buried beneath the surface, waiting for the right conditions to rise. Weston Trevino. My cousin. My childhood playmate. The person who had been a part of my life for as long as I could remember. We weren't just family, we were connected in a way that felt deeper, almost unspoken. Growing up, Weston was my protector. He was the one who stood up for me when the older kids tried to push me around, the one who held my hand when we crossed the street, the one who sat next to me at family gatherings because he knew I hated being surrounded by too many people. He was always there. And I adored him for it. As kids, we spent every summer together. Climbing trees, racing bikes, sneaking extra cookies from the kitchen when our mothers weren't looking. He used to pull my pigtails and call me a brat, and I'd chase him around the house, swearing I'd get my revenge. But no matter how much we teased each other, there was never any real distance between us. Back then, he saw me as just a little girl, his younger cousin, his responsibility, nothing more. And I never expected anything different. But things change. People change. I think I first noticed it when I was about 16. Weston had come over for the summer like he always did, but something was different. He was taller, stronger, more grown. His voice had deepened, his shoulders had broadened, and suddenly, he wasn't just Weston anymore. He was a man. I remember the way I looked at him that year, realizing that he was attractive, not just in the way family members say, "Oh, you've grown up so well," but in a way that made my stomach tighten. In a way that made me feel things I knew I shouldn't feel. I pushed it down. I ignored it. I told myself it was just a phase, just a silly crush, just admiration. I convinced myself that the way my heart raced when he smiled at me was nothing. That the heat I felt when he ruffled my hair was meaningless. And for a long time, I believed that. Because Weston didn't see me that way. To him, I was still just Kimura, the girl who used to cry when she scraped her knee, the girl who followed him around like a shadow, the girl who would always be a little too young, a little too familiar, a little too off limits. He never looked at me the way I looked at him. Not until now. This time, when Weston came to visit, something was different. The way he carried himself, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. At first, I thought I was imagining it. That I was projecting my own desires onto him, seeing what I wanted to see. But the signs were there, subtle but undeniable. The way his gaze would drift down my body when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his fingers would brush against mine, slow and deliberate, before he pulled away. The way he would sit just a little too close, his arm pressing against mine, his breath warm on my skin. Had he always looked at me like this? Or had something shifted between us, something neither of us wanted to name? I told myself it was nothing. That I was reading too much into it. That he was just being friendly, just being Weston. But deep down, I knew better. And no matter how much I tried to suppress it, I couldn't ignore the way my body responded. I wanted him. And I hated myself for it. I told myself to stop. To keep my distance. To remember who he was and what he meant to me. But the problem with desire is that once you acknowledge it, once you let yourself feel it, it doesn't just go away. It lingers. It festers. And eventually, it consumes you. I should have known better. From the moment Weston walked through the door, something in the air felt charged, different from all the other times he'd visited. There was an energy between us, thick and unspoken, like a current humming just beneath the surface. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it. But the way he looked at me, it wasn't my imagination. It started subtly, so subtly that I could have ignored it if I had tried hard enough. The way his eyes would sweep over me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The way his jaw would clench when I stretched, my shirt riding up just enough to expose my stomach. It wasn't just me anymore. He felt it too. And I wanted to see how far I could push it. I started testing him in ways that even I wasn't fully ready to admit. Little things, short dresses, bare shoulders, the way I'd stretch out on the couch, making sure the curve of my body was on full display. It was a game, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to win. And the worst part? Weston wasn't stopping me. The tension between us built slowly, like a fire creeping along dry wood, waiting for the moment it would finally catch. There was a night when we were alone in the kitchen, just the two of us. The house was quiet, everyone else asleep. I reached for a glass in the cabinet, and he was behind me before I even realized he had moved. Close. Too close. His chest brushed my back, his breath warm against the side of my neck. I should have stepped away. I should have moved. But I didn't. Neither did he. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that holds weight, that says more than words ever could. I turned my head, just slightly, just enough that if either of us moved even an inch closer. But we didn't. He cleared his throat, stepped back, and the moment passed. And yet, it lingered. Then there were the conversations, late at night, when the house was quiet and the walls felt thinner than they actually were. We sat outside on the back porch, the air thick with summer heat, the stars stretched out above us. He asked me about my life, my plans, things he had never cared about before. His voice was softer, deeper, and when he spoke, it felt like he was saying more than just words. At one point, I laughed. Something he said wasn't even that funny, but I laughed anyway, just to fill the silence. His eyes flickered to my lips, and for the briefest second, his expression shifted. Like he wanted to kiss me. Like he would kiss me, if only I let him. But he didn't. Instead, he exhaled, looked away, and changed the subject. A safe subject. A distant subject. But I knew. And he knew that I knew. Then came the moment that shattered the illusion that I had any control left. It was late. I had been helping my mom in the kitchen, and when I finally went back to my room, I noticed my door was slightly open. I should have knocked. I should have walked away. But something told me not to. I pushed the door open just a little more, just enough to see inside. And there he was. Weston. In my room. Holding something, my something. His back was to me, but I could see his shoulders rise and fall, his breath uneven. I should have felt angry. Violated. disgusted. But I didn't. I felt heat rush through my body, a kind of hunger that scared me. I should have left. Should have slammed the door, should have screamed at him, should have done anything but stand there, watching. But I stayed. And that's when I knew, this wasn't just in my head. This was real. And I wasn't going to stop it. Instead, I stepped forward. Something inside me cracked open, a reckless hunger, a need I could no longer suppress. I had spent so long denying it, convincing myself that the way I looked at him didn't mean anything, that the way my pulse quickened when he was near was just a trick of the mind. But in that moment, none of my justifications mattered. All I saw was him. And the way he looked at me when he finally turned around. It wasn't shame. It wasn't disgust. It was something just as dangerous as what I was feeling. And that was all it took. I don't remember who moved first. If it was me or him. If it even mattered. But what I do remember, what I will never forget, is the way time seemed to stop the second I crossed the line. One moment, I was watching him, waiting, holding my breath. The next, I was lost in something I couldn't control. I told myself it was inevitable. That this moment had been building for years, waiting for the right spark to set everything ablaze. That it wasn't a choice but something written into us long before either of us could understand it. But that was a lie. It was always a choice. And I made the wrong one. It didn't last long. A few moments. A blur of heat, of desperation, of unspoken need unraveling all at once. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. And the silence that followed was unbearable. I pulled away first. Or maybe he did. He wouldn't look at me. Wouldn't speak. The weight of what we had done crashed down between us like a tidal wave, pulling us under, leaving nothing but wreckage in its wake. I wanted to say something. Anything. But what was there to say? That I was sorry? That I wasn't sorry? That I had wanted it for so long, and now that it had happened, I didn't know what to do with myself? Before I could find the words, he was gone. He didn't slam the door. He didn't yell. He just left. And just like that, everything changed. Morning came too soon. I hadn't slept. How could I? My mind had been spinning all night, replaying the moment over and over, searching for some way to make sense of it. But no matter how many times I tried to reshape it in my head, no matter how many excuses I whispered to myself in the dark, the truth remained the same. I had done something I couldn't take back. I could still feel the weight of it on my skin. My lips still tingled with the memory. My body still hummed with the remnants of something forbidden. For a fleeting second, I let myself believe that maybe it meant something. That maybe Weston had felt what I had felt. That maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something instead of the end. But when I saw him that morning, I knew. He was already gone. Not physically. He was still there, sitting at the breakfast table, coffee in hand, nodding absent-mindedly as my mother spoke to him about something meaningless. But he wasn't really there. His eyes wouldn't meet mine. His shoulders were tense, his jaw locked tight, his grip on his coffee mug just a little too firm. He wasn't angry. He wasn't cruel. He was just absent. I sat down across from him, my heart pounding, waiting, hoping, for some sign that he felt the same pull I did. But there was nothing. And that's when it hit me. I had spent the entire night convincing myself that what happened between us had been inevitable. That it had been years in the making, that there was something cosmic and undeniable about the way we had fallen into each other. But it wasn't destiny. It was a mistake. A reckless, selfish, irreversible mistake. And Weston knew it. I spent the rest of the day waiting for him to speak to me. To acknowledge what had happened. To say anything. But he didn't. He avoided me. He stayed in the living room with my father, watching sports. He went out for a drive. He kept himself surrounded by people, never alone, never giving me a chance to pull him aside. And with every passing hour, my stomach twisted tighter. I thought back to the way he had looked at me before. The tension, the heat, the way I had convinced myself that he wanted this just as badly as I did. Had I been wrong? Had I misread everything? Or had he simply regretted it the second it was over? The thought made me sick. I had spent so long craving his attention, imagining what it would feel like if he finally saw me the way I had always seen him. But now that it had happened, all I felt was hollow. This wasn't some secret romance. This wasn't the beginning of a love story. It was regret. It was shame. And worst of all, it was silence. That night, when the house had gone quiet, I found him outside on the porch. He was leaning against the railing, staring out at the dark sky, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I stood in the doorway, waiting for him to say something. He didn't. So I did. Weston. My voice was barely above a whisper, but he flinched like I had shouted his name. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought maybe he'd finally tell me what he was thinking. Maybe he'd say he felt the same way, that he had spent the entire day fighting the same war inside his head. But instead, he just shook his head. And then he said the words that shattered whatever illusion I had left. We can't talk about this. Ever. His voice was cold. Distant. Final. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Because there was nothing left to say. I watched him walk past me, back inside the house, back into the world where none of this had ever happened. And just like that, he was gone. But the weight of what we had done? That would never leave me. The day Weston left, I watched him go without saying a word. I stood by the window as he loaded his bags into the car, my hands clenched at my sides, my breath coming in shallow, uneven waves. I thought I would cry. But there were no tears. Just emptiness. A hollow, aching space inside me where something should have been, but wasn't. I told myself I wouldn't reach out to him, wouldn't text, wouldn't try to fix what was already beyond repair. But when he looked up, just for a second, just long enough for our eyes to meet through the glass, I felt something crack inside me. For a split second, I thought maybe he would say something. Do something. Give me some kind of closure. But he didn't. He turned away. Got in the car. Drove off. And just like that, he was gone. I spent the next few days in a haze, drifting through conversations I wasn't really a part of, nodding at things I didn't hear. The world around me felt distant, muted, like I was watching my own life from the outside. My mother noticed. She asked if I was feeling okay, if something was wrong. I almost told her. Not the truth, of course, I could never tell her the truth, but something. Anything. That I felt like I was coming apart, that I had done something I didn't know how to live with, that I didn't even recognize myself anymore. But instead, I forced a smile and said I was fine. Because what else could I do? What words could possibly fix this? At night, when the house was quiet, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every choice, every warning sign I ignored. I had thought this would fulfill me. That finally having him would make the ache go away. But it didn't. If anything, it made it worse. Because now, I had to live with the truth. I had chased something I was never meant to have. I had ignored every voice in my head telling me to stop, convinced myself that the heat, the tension, the longing was bigger than consequences. That somehow, I was different. That somehow, I wouldn't be the one left picking up the pieces. But that's the thing about desire. It doesn't care about logic. It doesn't care about consequences. It consumes. And once you give into it, once you let it take over, there's no undoing what's been done. You just have to live with it. I don't know if Weston will ever speak to me again. I don't know if he'll pretend it never happened or if he lies awake at night, the same way I do, wondering how things could have been different. But I do know this, there's no future in what we did. No happy ending. Only regret. Only silence. Only a version of myself that I can never be again. Some lessons you learn too late. And this? This was mine. Desire can be intoxicating, but not every craving is meant to be indulged. Some lines, once crossed, leave scars that never heal. And sometimes, the worst betrayal isn't of someone else, it's of yourself. We think we're in control until we're not. We tell ourselves we won't cross the line, until we do. And by the time we realize the damage, it's already too late. That's my story. My truth. The choice that changed everything. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever made a decision you couldn't take back? Something that left you questioning who you were? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. And if this story made you feel something, if it made you think, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones we need to hear the most.